Well, thank you very much. Welcome to my home, and thanks for having me in yours. And Mike, you're right. When you feel like this is a year unlike any others, in fact, unlike any others in our lifetimes, if it feels like 2020 is historically disruptive, you ought to trust your instincts. As you point out, we have unusual events, and we went back and we took a look from 1900. This is the 31st presidential election, many of them intense, some more than others. This is the 24th recession since 1900. How frequently there are mass social protests, multi-city sustained. There's no official scoring mechanism, but it feels when I went back and looked in the 20s, maybe low 30s. Thankfully, few pandemics. But how many years had all four of these super disruptors all happening at once, to say nothing of the climate challenges? One, 2020. And in trying to understand for your businesses and for the nation what all of this disruption would mean, as we studied it, we concluded we think 2020 is going to prove to be more accelerative than transformational. It's going to take trends that defined yesterday, explain what's happening today, and accelerate them going into tomorrow. And so today I'm going to talk about what are those trends that brought us here, that explain why so much of what is going on today is happening, and help us anticipate the future so we can get in front of it. So first, yesterday, and I'll talk about technology trends, geopolitical trends, and cultural trends. Obviously, AIM would not be having a virtual meeting 30 years ago, but over the last 3 decades, everything became digitized, everything became networked. Increasingly, things were made mobile and influenced by social media. It creates extraordinary opportunities to innovate, to leverage digital tools, to run smarter businesses, to provide better healthcare, to create an app and find 4 billion customers. But it also created what the McKinsey Global Institute described as a superstar economy, where those with higher skills, better education, access to capital in the right industries not only have a lead, but their lead is growing over the rest of the world. The inequality that we're seeing in wealth, the inequality that we're seeing in income has been growing. At the same time as well, we see these very dominant data platforms leading some to worry about the state of competition. And as a result, we saw heading into 2020 what some call a techlash, a backlash against the digitally dominant competitors, players, worried about competition, worried about consumer protection. That was a very disruptive 3 decades. But while it was going on, the world was changing. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. 2 years later, the Soviet Empire dissolved, and all of those nations joined the global economy. That same year, 1991, there were significant reforms in India, bringing them more into the global economy. And only 2 years after that, the same sort of reforms brought China far more into the global picture. And that same year, 1993, the EU was born. Add one more year, you have the World Trade Organization created and NAFTA passing. And as a result, the world defined by the East versus West big bifurcation in the Cold War ended. It was a unipolar world with global integration as the watchword. And we had hyperglobalization, huge opportunities to run global businesses, to access capital around the world, talent around the world, markets around the world. But it also created a backlash as well. In this case, many Americans in the middle class, but also others in Western countries in the middle class, perceived the giant sucking sound of their jobs being taken to places like China and Mexico as a result of labor arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage, or tax arbitrage. They felt like the winners were poor people in developing countries and rich people in America, but not them. And meanwhile, we were all assured that China, as a result of joining the WTO, would become more liberalized, but of course it's become more authoritarian. So a second backlash had emerged heading into this year, the backlash against globalization. It led to the election of populists in places like Brazil and Mexico, the United States, the Brexit in the UK. That's also a really disruptive 3 decades that was happening at the same time. And while all that was going on, the country was changing. In 1970, 68% of Americans were white and had not gone to college, comfortable in their conformity. But for a lot of Americans, especially Americans of color, and in many ways women, not nearly enough opportunity to be seen, to be heard, to succeed. Over the next 4 decades, as a result of both civil rights movements and demographic change, there have been far more opportunities created for new voices to be heard. As is clear from the murder of George Floyd, we still have a long way to go to realize our ideals, but there are still more opportunities than there have ever been before as of 2020. But one of the voices that got lost is the voice of the referee. The most trusted person in America in 1969 was not a business leader, was not a religious figure, was not a government leader. It was Walter Cronkite, the guy who read the news on TV. And Americans would watch the news every night with their families. Why? To be informed. What's happening with Vietnam or Sputnik or Watergate? We would go into political debates, we would go into elections with a shared set of ground facts and truths. And maybe you think policy should be A or B, but we all agree on what the underlying facts were. Yet these days, that's not really what the media does. In a far more competitive landscape, the media affirms. If you're right of center, you watch Fox. If you're left of center, MSNBC or CNN. They don't tell you the other side is the loyal opposition with a difference of policy opinion. They increasingly sell the concept that the other side is a threat to the nation. And as a result, the backlash here moves in two directions. For many, the backlash is against change taking too long. How can we still not be anything close to racial justice so many years after the death of Dr. King? For others, it's a backlash against change happening too fast, too much political correctness, people who feel either, as they tell pollsters, like strangers in their own country or like they can't get ahead. It was an age of disruption heading into 2020. And to make sense of this in the 20th century, we might have turned to institutions that we were part of and that we trusted. But in the 21st century, those institutions have lost our trust. The radical transparency of the internet has revealed they're all led, or many are led, by all too human people who have flaws. And when you ask Americans, as Gallup does every year, about their trust in institutions, what you find is if you compare 1979 to 2019, institution after institution has seen an erosion of trust, with the only exception of the military. So in a world that's accelerating, where disruption is accelerating, and where we no longer trust the institutions, including political parties, to take care of us, what happens to our politics? Disruption arrives. There's a federal election every 2 years. In the 10 federal elections between 1960 and 1978, 3 saw the party in control of the House, the Senate, or the White House change hands. Fast forward 10 more federal elections from 1980 to 1998. Of those 10, 4 were change elections. This century, of course, we've had 10 more federal elections from 2000 to 2018. And of the 10 this century, 8 have been change elections. For those whose theory of everything is it's all explained because of Donald Trump, he arrived politically in 2016. He's much more logically a symptom than a cause. And it's my belief at core that the cause is the failure of the 20th century policies, institutions, political parties to make the average American feel protected against the realities of the 21st century. You know, and we open with some of these extraordinary events that are happening. These are perfect examples of ways in which the world and the nation were increasingly fragile, but the policies and leaders didn't do what they should have. So who could have ever seen a pandemic coming? Well, any reader of Time magazine to start with. Whether it's the SARS cover of 2003, H1N1, how bad will it get in 07, why you'll be wearing masks again in 09, or Bill Gates' TED Talk in 2015, the next outbreak, we're not ready. Likewise, nobody should be shocked about a K-shaped recovery or about the failures of our safety net. They were hiding in plain view. More than half of American families lacking emergency savings were very hard pressed. The 36 million Americans without health insurance were likelier to have pre-existing conditions, making the COVID lethality much worse. More than 21 million Americans households don't have broadband at home. Those folks can't work from home, and their kids can't learn at home when schools are virtual or somewhat virtual. If you don't have paid sick leave, then when you spiked a fever in March or April, you still went to the restaurant. You still went to the meatpacking plant. Your family needed the income, but as a result, the disease spread. And likewise, there's clear gaps and challenges with racial justice, but they were known, or they should have been known. The income gap between African American households and white households is centuries, if we're honest, in the making. The wealth gap, 10 to 1, which is extraordinary. If you're unarmed and you're African American, you're more than 4 times as likely to be killed if you encounter the police than if you're white and unarmed. And if you're African American, you're far likelier to be in jail. All of these realities were true, and they set us up for the challenges that we're facing today. So where are we today? I'll talk about, again, technology, geopolitics, and culture. Technologically, one thing that's been clear is that the digitized are thriving. Tech companies in particular but plenty of non-tech but digitally enabled companies. Fidelity leaps to mind, really smart at using and leveraging information technology companies, able to work from home, maintaining productivity, innovating. Certainly the market has rewarded the digitized, while the S&P 500, not including the IT sector, is down, or the IT companies is down about 5%. The most famous IT companies, off the charts successful, powering the economy. But while the digitized have thrived, the undigitized, the eds, the meds, the feds have failed. Kind of extraordinary that 19 years after 9/11 attacks shut down all of the commercial airspace over the United States, there still was no plan in Congress to be able to operate outside of Washington. They recently put something in place they call proxy voting, and they're all proud and they're crowing about it. But think about the fact that the biggest innovation in congressional process in decades is literally phoning it in. Elections are coming up. Some states only have voting by mail, which, by the way, has been secure and fraud-free so far. Many states have created absentee opportunities for those who cannot or are afraid to vote in person. But almost no states have flexibility. Do any of us really know what the first week of November is going to look like about a second COVID wave? If there is one, a lot of folks are going to want flexibility that's not available. Through the pandemic, we've started to see how valuable telehealth can be. Part of what makes the NBA succeed, and look, part of it is they can go to a bubble in Disney World. Most of us can't do that. But part of what makes the NBA succeed as well, they're all wearing these Aura rings. We're seeing great advances in wearable and some of the telehealth innovations, but a lot of barriers to telehealth have been in place for decades, put there in part by people who didn't want telehealth to succeed, or put there in part because there weren't the competitive pressures necessary. Had we been doing more telehealth in advance, we would be in a better position and have a healthier nation. And likewise, when you think about schools, in the case of the state of New York, and I bet it's similar in the state of Massachusetts, lawmakers had required the schools to have 12 fire drills per year, not 11, not 13. And they micromanaged that 8 of them have to be escape drills, 4 of which would use the fire escapes, 4 shelter-in-place drills. That matters. We certainly don't want kids stuck in burning buildings. But how often did they practice learning remotely? How often did they train teachers to teach from afar? And the answer is never. And we're seeing the failures. When you think about, for all of us in business, being able to work virtually, being able to learn and teach oneself from anywhere are clearly necessary 21st century skills. How come the schools haven't been teaching? With respect to geopolitics, it's clear multilateralism was sick before COVID. As a result of the trade wars, the cooperation, the coordination, the trust among world leaders had been shredded. So if you put a great business in charge, what they might have done is they might have had the ventilators and personal protective gear start in China, just in time go to Italy, and then Spain, then New York City and Boston, and right where you need them, right when you need them. Instead, the countries have all been fighting over stockpiling their own protective gear for their doctors and nurses. And hell, states have had to fight one another because there isn't a single point of federal leadership saying we're going to buy for the nation and we're going to distribute. States are told, well, you guys are responsible for figuring out yourselves. The 2 world nations best positioned to help us get through this would be the United States and China, but we're not cooperating. We're blaming each other. And if we're honest, I personally think China deserves a decent amount of blame here. When the disease came out, President Xi played it down. He didn't alert the world to exactly how dangerous it was, because he either didn't want people to panic or he wanted people to think he was in charge. But by playing it down, the rest of us weren't able to prepare adequately. We'll see if nation states fail, but we know food insecurity is growing, and there is the very scary risk that more people around the world may die of hunger as a result of COVID than of COVID itself. Now, you won't believe this given the way I've started, but I'm actually an optimist. And when this all started, I thought, here's a global, phenomenon. This is going to lead to better global cooperation. But I'm probably misapplying in my mind the lessons of world wars, 1815 or 1945. But world wars were failures of diplomacy. Usually you fix what was broken. And around the world, and certainly in the United States, for many citizens and policymakers, the failures here were excessive reliance on foreign supply chains and excessive allowance of travel and tourism from abroad. And I think nationalism is likely the result this time. Culturally, what I feel like, growing up with a Mr. Smith goes to Washington mindset, we should feel like we're all in this together. But it doesn't feel that way. Instead, it feels like this is the new ground zero on culture wars. COVID is the new climate change. So recall with the financial collapse, the government had a net bailout of $500 billion. We maxed out at 8.6 million Americans without jobs at the peak. A quarter of us were on social media. That was enough to give rise on the left to the Occupy movement, demanding more redistribution. On the right, to the Tea Party movement, demanding smaller government. Well, this time the bailouts are already 6 times bigger, and they're negotiating whether to make it 10 times bigger. We have 7 times as many Americans at peak who lost jobs and needed unemployment. 3 times as many Americans are on social media. We're not calling ourselves Occupy 2.0 or Tea Party 2.0, but it sure feels that way. On the left, they say you need to trust science, you fools. And on the right, they ask, you mean the scientists at the CDC who blew the tests back in January and February? Or the experts who assured us Saddam had weapons of mass destruction? On the left, as with climate, this is about collective responsibility. You owe this to your neighbors, to your children, to the old couple down the street who are at greater risk of dying if you don't wear a mask. On the right, it's the voice of Elon Musk. If you don't want to go to work, I'm not going to make you go to work. Why are you telling me I can't go to work? I've spent my life building my business, and I'm prepared to take the risk of something that has less than 1% lethality. You shouldn't block me. On the left, they say we need to save lives, and of course they're right. But on the right, they say we need to save jobs, and they're right too. So we've become a nation in masks, astounded at the ignorance of those in MAGA hats, and a nation in MAGA hats, astounded at the arrogance of those who think everybody can work from home and that all cities should follow New York City's strict rules. The events of this year have and will continue with the next, I think it's 39 days, maybe one fewer, to redefine the 2020 elections. The election's now going to be fought in 3 lanes: the pandemic, the economy, and what I call culture. But really, who do you think is better fit to help the country get through challenges that we face? With respect to the pandemic, Donald Trump says he is a wartime president. He's a master of visuals. He looks like a wartime president most of the time in front of the camera. I think his biggest challenge is, if this is a war, it feels like 1942, 1943. It doesn't feel like 1945, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. And when you take a look at the president's net approval on handling the pandemic, he's found wanting. This is not a badge of honor. People are not going to reelect the president on the theory of this guy has done a brilliant job, as compared to Germany or others. But that's not the only question that's going to be in voters' mind. We're also obviously in a recession. It is very risky, very challenging, and the president and the White House are trying to set up a choice. The choice is between the reopener in chief and what they'll call Lockdown Joe. The polls to date consistently, even people who don't like the president, who say his tweets are offensive or they're certainly unnecessary, but they tend to say they think the president will do a better job than the former vice president at handling the economy. So there are going to be a decent amount of voters who walk in and say, look, my biggest thing is I think we need growth again. That's going to be low taxes, fewer regulations, and I'm willing to suffer through the tweets to get the economic policies I think matter. The last question is, who do you think's better suited to lead? And in this regard, the next 30 whatever days are going to see lots and lots of hideous negative ads, because the campaigns are trying to define the other as unfit. So the closing argument for the Trump campaign is you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. He's too weak. He's too woke or politically correct. He's been in Washington too long. For the Biden campaign, the argument is that Donald Trump's a failed president. He failed America. He's too divisive. He's too chaotic. He's too corrupt. If we were talking about a 20th century election, we'd have asked the polling question, who would you rather get a beer with? In the 21st century, it's not who do you like more, it's who do you dislike less. In the 2016 exit polls, voters who did not like Hillary Clinton and did not like Donald Trump went for Trump by 17 points. Right now, according to polls, and this is a bit of an average, I've seen higher, I've seen a few lower. If you don't like Donald Trump and you don't like Joe Biden, you've been going for Joe Biden by 34 points. For the Trump campaign, they're trying everything they can at this point to take the bark off Joe Biden, hoping maybe it'll happen in the debate that's coming up, while at the same time, promising, last night they promised $200 for every senior drug discount, although they actually don't have anywhere to take the money from, but we'll see how that works out. But that's what is going to define the campaign for the next remaining weeks, with the debate on Tuesday being a really big deal. For me, my biggest concern isn't even candidate A wins or candidate B wins, but rather that we get to the week after the election and it's unclear. We know there's historic interest in voting. The 2018 midterms had the highest turnout in 104 years. The pre-election year polls for CNN had the highest level of extremely interested in history. A record number, 83%, told Pew this election really matters. It's more than any time they've ever asked that question. And we know that Democrats tend to be more wary of the virus. They're more likely to vote in person. Democrats are more likely to vote by mail. Republicans say they're more likely to vote in person. And we know that even if Ben Franklin were in charge of the post office, to say nothing of the post office, which happens for whatever reason to be going through a lot of operational changes that seems to have slowed down deliveries. But if you ask for your ballot at the last second, it will not get there in time, no matter who's running the post office. A lot of people have relocated to live with their parents or to live somewhere else, so they're going to be dislocated voters, which is always a challenge. There are fewer volunteers. The odds of everything going swimmingly on November 3rd are really low. The media, of course, is paid to amplify outrage, so they're not going to have a remain calm, all is well message. Both on regular media and social media, they're going to be pointing out this election is being stolen from you, and it's only a question of whether you're on the right or the left who hear it. Think about the fact that right now in Portland, we have armed groups facing one another. Deaths have occurred outside a courthouse in Portland, and they're not counting votes in that courthouse yet. Now, I had promised that I'm an optimist, and nobody possibly believes me. I'm going to do my best to resuscitate the reputation in my remaining remarks here. So, thinking about where things go, again, let's look technology, geopolitics, and culture. I'm actually really excited technologically. Recall, we sent a man to the moon and back, and sure, that was great for the nation coming together. But for me, the story that isn't adequately told are all of the things that were secondary benefits, like the real launch of the semiconductor industry, or innovations like Velcro. The war on COVID will yield, hopefully, some vaccines that work, some improved therapeutics. But there are extraordinary investments being made. There are extraordinary improvements in business processes. It's going to make business more productive. It's going to make wearables far more valuable. It's going to make all of us healthier, safer, and more successful in the future. We don't see it right now because it's such a you-know-what show out there. But extraordinary innovation is being funded, and process improvements are happening. Now, to be fair, just as the innovation of the last 3 decades increased inequality, the premium on having a STEM degree will only go up. The value of being more digitized will only increase. So inequality is going to continue to grow. The techlash is already roaring back as a case against Google drops any second now. That's something to be minded, but I'm excited about the innovation. Geopolitically, the world order that was built after World War II, US versus Soviet, I mean, that world ended. We are kind of overdue to rethink. A unipolar American world could never stand. One of the things that's clear is the great power rivalry is back. US-China friction will increase whether it's a President Biden or a continued President Trump. How they approach bringing our allies on side to contain and confront China, they have a difference of opinion. But the idea that we need to stand up to China to push back, whether it's human rights or intellectual property or economic policy, it's guaranteed happening either way. These great multilateral institutions serve their purpose and serve them well, but the Soviet Empire is long gone. They need new missions, new mandates, new models. I talk about deglobalization. Certainly the rate of growth in the cross-border data flow will shrink for data, goods, people, capital, and knowledge. And while, look, Adam Smith and David Ricardo got the economics of comparative advantage right, when you can automate a job, you don't send it abroad. When you can do additive manufacturing, 3D printing, the jobs don't go to developing economies around the world. And even in the Western nations, what you're going to find is, as a result of nationalism, the economics of trade are disrupted, whether it's the sticks of tariffs and export controls or the carrots of subsidies for reshoring. The world is changing. If we get it right, our country can be stronger and the world can be safer, but it's going to be very choppy for a decade. Politically, culturally, we've been seeing a party realignment that was true before the Trump era. It's on steroids, accelerating now. It's four ways. First, education. When I graduated college, if you had a college degree, you were 4% more likely to be a Republican. Today, you are 20%, if you have a college degree, more likely to be a Democrat. Second, gender gap. When NBC pollsters asked women which party they would rather see control Congress, it was Democratic Party +6 in 2010. It's Democratic Party +22 at the end of last year. We see a growing rural-urban divide. A clever political scientist, Dave Wasserman, observed that urban counties tend to have Whole Foods markets. Rural counties tend to have Cracker Barrel. So he took a look at the Democratic Party's winning percentage in counties with Whole Foods, which has been growing, versus counties with Cracker Barrels, which has been shrinking. And what he found is the gap when Bill Clinton got elected was 20 points. It went to 25 when he was reelected and has grown every election since. Finally, we're seeing a differential in the demographics of the parties. In 1961, 95% of House Republicans and 93% of Democrat elected to the House were both white and male. These days, to their credit, the Democratic Party looks a lot more like America. Only 38% are both white and male. By contrast, my Republican Party has only gotten down to 90%. Now, I'm an optimist, so the good news is by the year 25, 24, we're going to look like America. But I think the real challenge is if you want to lead people in an increasingly diverse country, they need to know you know where they're coming from, that you've walked in their shoes, you can appreciate their challenges. And if you don't look like them, it's harder to gain their trust and mantle of leadership. We'll see how this year goes, but it sure feels like in four ways new psychology is coming, and that's going to change how government, businesses, and individuals prioritize things. So first, the efficiency, just in time, is giving way to a focus on resilience, just in case. For government, that means they're going to start funding empty hospital beds, stockpiles of equipment, things that make us more resilient, more ready. Businesses aren't going to move all of the supply chains from China to the United States, but they're going to move out of China more than they've been and look for alternatives. We're already rethinking how offices look, but we're also rethinking how frequently we're going to go downtown. Now, I can't wait to go back downtown, but I may be a 4-day-a-week and not a 5-day-a-week guy in the future. Individuals more likely to take cars than metros. They may want to live in suburbs as opposed to cities. The focus on interdependence is giving way to a focus on self-sufficiency. So we used to talk about just the defense industrial base. It's already expanded to things like 5G and tech and semiconductors. It's going to expand further to pharmaceuticals, personal protective gear. And while the borders will reopen even to Americans someday, there will surely be new limits around health and resilience. Businesses that had been focusing on getting into every market global integration are looking at questions of vertical integration. How do you gain greater control over your own supply chains so that geopolitical risks don't disrupt your ability to produce? And many of us have been cooking, working, and schooling from home. I can't wait to go back to restaurants, but I'm probably not going back to Starbucks. So I've got a great routine. I make a great cup of coffee in the morning, and I like reading the paper on the porch. And by the way, I'm saving some bucks. The huge appetite for leverage and risk that defined the world right up until about February, or on Robinhood till, I don't know, yesterday, is giving way to a focus on margin and safety. After the 9/11 attacks, you had new laws on transportation security and cargo security. After the financial collapse, you had new rules on banking and systemic risk. Clearly, we're looking at significant regulations coming for greater pandemic preparedness, and we're going to have to find ways to have smarter safety nets and not just have these extraordinary bailouts happen every 8-9 years because the system isn't otherwise well designed. Businesses are thinking about liability risks, thinking about what size of a rainy day fund they're actually going to need. Individuals may be more inclined to rent than own, work for a big employer than a startup. Finally, the mindset of abundance is giving way to a mindset of austerity. And think about 25-year-olds who work in your organization. If you're 25, in the first month of first grade, you were sent home because of the 9/11 attacks. In the first month of 8th grade, when you got home, your parents might have been sitting around the kitchen table wondering if they could afford the mortgage. These days, you're sitting on a mountain of student debt, for a college degree you were told you needed, maybe you just got furloughed. How will that affect your thinking, your spending, your impact on the economy? Well, if it's as bad as it could be, we've lived it. It's called the Great Depression. And what you saw is that generation saved more, spent less, borrowed less, was much more cautious. And that slows economic growth, as we know. Businesses may want to hold deeper reserves. If you're still paying dividends and share buybacks at the same time you're taking money from the government on a loan program or borrowing at the Fed for almost zero interest, the hyperactivists are coming for you. That creates huge challenges for your brand. For government, look, they could have been smarter about the program. They frankly should have already put more money out there, but the money they dropped from helicopters helped avert a Great Depression. The challenge is it always plays the same. Now, all right, how do we start paying it back? And they typically aim at cutting discretionary spending. That could be infrastructure, that could be education, that could be R&D, and they're clearly going to need to find more revenue, which means they're going to look to raise taxes. I'll conclude again promising that I was optimistic. I don't know if I've sold anybody on that, but I at least read a lot of history. And we're as high as we've ever seen in inequality, but we've been this high before. We're as high as we've ever been in levels of foreign-born Americans. For some, that's a problem. For others, that's an opportunity, but we're fighting about it as much as we've ever done. New technologies have changed how we work, live, play, and learn. We're finding the top 0.1% dominating our elections by spending, and we end up with red states and blue states election after election in what feels very gridlock Washington. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, hey, something's wrong with this moron's PowerPoint. Maybe he shouldn't have brought 500 PowerPoint slides, but that's actually not a mistake. That's the Electoral College map from 1888. And if you go back and you read about America in the Gilded Age, you'd find that this slide is a perfect encapsulation of what America was like in the Gilded Age. And the reason that I'm an optimist is that change came. The Bezos, the Google guys of their day were Rockefeller and Carnegie. They invented antitrust law to make the economy more competitive and to work better. There was food safety laws and worker safety laws and child labor protections. To deal with income inequality, they amended the Constitution to put the income tax in place. There were political reforms, direct election of senators, giving women the right to vote. There were social reforms. Groups like AIM went to the State House in Boston and went to work with government leaders and said, we're not getting the workforce we need to succeed in this industrial era. That American kids back at the turn of the 1900s were only getting educated through 8th grade, and they weren't learning skills that were relevant to this new 20th century industrial era. And something called the high school movement was born. And over a couple of decades, every state created K through 12, imparting the skills needed to succeed. And as a result of those sort of reforms, America dominated the 20th century. We had the best workforce in the world. I believed heading into the 20th century, we were headed towards a decade of reform for the reason I opened with, because the policies of the 20th century aren't protecting people against the realities of the 21st century. I think the odds of a reform era have only accelerated. Clearly, we need to modernize the safety net. Clearly, we need to reimagine regulation. The Chicago school does not deal with the data-dominant players. There could be more pandemics. Cyber remains a massive risk that's under-accounted for, despite the great work of Rapid7 up there in Boston. There is climate. We're not doing anything about climate, but we're getting hammered all the time. For me, the biggest challenge, and by the way, this is my next to last slide, one more click, is we need to expand the winner circle. I'm a capitalist. I have my own business that I founded with a good Bostonian partner. We only work for for-profit businesses, but a superstar economy where a winner circle is as small as it is, with so little opportunity for others to socially advance, will keep generating populism and will keep undermining the climate for innovators and entrepreneurs to succeed. So my last slide, 5 recommendations for leaders, what we've been working with business leaders, how to prepare. First, trust is the most important brand attribute this decade. First and foremost, your brand, when you take a look at your market cap, so much is intangible now, so much is your brand. They're going to be asking for years, what did you do to help during 2020? Governments, media, activists. If you're helping your stakeholders, if you're improving your communities, if you are there for others, it will pay extraordinary dividends. Number 2, you can be a disruptor, you can be disrupted. Ask Betamax, ask BlackBerry how it feels to be the latter. Number three, we're in an era where nationalism pays for politicians. That's what they're running on, and that's what they get rewarded for. But we know as a business matter, multilateralism is both makes for less wars around the world and for more economic opportunities. So it's going to be up to business leaders to partner with other business leaders around the world and to highlight the benefits of collaboration. Once upon a time, if you want it in Washington, you hire my firm, it would happen around the world. I'd love to tell you that's still true, but it's not. Increasingly, we're seeing policy driven in foreign capitals, in state capitals, by mayors and cities, by attorneys general. The only way to succeed is both to engage, to make sure you're aware of your increasing political risk all over the place, but to also have stakeholders that you invest in, that you help now, so that they're there to help you. Because last point, this reform era is coming. It's frankly necessary. It's inexorable. You can't just say, no, all proposed reforms are socialism. Everything the way it's always been is the right answer, because we know it's not true, but it's also not politically sustainable. Groups like AIM, therefore, make a really big difference, engaging with policymakers, giving them insights from the actual real world to help them get the policies right. It matters what you do. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm going to hopefully stop showing my screen.